It's about time that I played some Strat-O-Matic. Well, as many of you know, I grew up playing APA baseball. Actually, the truth is that I did buy a copy of Strat-O-Matic once back in 2007. I had a few seasons and played a few games with it, but sadly I wound up having to sell off that collection about a decade ago because of financial issues. Well, the truth though is that I didn't really play a whole ton of Strat-O-Matic back in those days. I clearly didn't play enough to get a real good feel for how the game really flows. So it's about time to fix that. Well, as luck would have it, I just so happen to have a copy of the Founders Edition, which is of course a reprint of the very first version of Strat-O-Matic Baseball. Well, if you haven't played it yet, you'd be kind of surprised at just how different the Founders Edition is from the Strat-O-Matic game that you're used to. In fact, this game feels like a beta version of the real game. And as you can see here, yes, I actually did it. I opened up a copy of the Founders Edition that was still sealed. Well, it wasn't a great financial decision, I guess. Still, I think that the prices for sealed versions of the Founders Edition are kind of exaggerated. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, the stuff inside is more important than keeping the box sealed and whatever that might be worth. One of the first things that I noticed is that the player cards were huge. These cards are 4 inches wide by 6 inches tall, which are huge by modern card standards. I had to order special size sleeves just to fit the cards. In fact, I couldn't even get any of my teams to fit into Ziploc bags. And if you look closely at the cards, you'll notice that something really basic is missing. That would be fielding. But let's back this up just a little bit. You see, Strat-O-Matic is kind of an odd game. On the one hand, it's unique. There was really nothing like it in the card and dice world back when it came out in 1961. But on the other hand, it was inspired by at least one other game. Well, as you know by now, there is an old tradition of dice baseball games. This tradition culminated in Clifford Van Beek's 1930 game National Pastime, which of course was a commercial failure. 20 years later, a man named J. Richard Seitz picked up National Pastime and created his own game. That was APA. By the time Strat-O-Matic was first released in 1961, APA was a well-established company and was doing really a massive amount of business. Now that's a really simplified version of the history of baseball tabletop simulation. In fact, I've already skipped over quite a few games, some of which you can probably name in the comments. But there's one game in particular that we really need to talk about to understand Strat-O-Matic. Well, that would be this game, Ethan Allen's All-Star Baseball game. Some of you have played it, though I'm betting that most of you haven't. It's lovingly referred to as the Spinner game. Now, Ethan Allen was a player back in the late 1920s and early 1930s. He played for 13 seasons and finished with an even .300 batting average. But you have to remember that this was like the late 20s, early 30s. That was the era of silly batting averages, everybody hitting the cover off the ball, of the rabbit ball and all that stuff. So Ethan wasn't quite as impressive as you would think at first glance at his stats. He also never made it to the All-Star game, kind of ironic. Allen's game first came out sometime in October 1941, and by December 1942 the game was available at stores for an incredibly low price. And this kind of gives you an idea of how his game was received. It was treated just as another child's toy. It really was never an extremely popular game, though the company did keep the game alive for decades. Well, the unique feature of this game was the spinning mechanic. Players were given discs like this instead of player cards. You attach the disc to the spinner at the bottom of the box, you spin the spinner, and then you'd get your result. Well, you're probably wondering what in the world all of this has to do with Strat-O-Matic, and it's time to get into that. The key to all of this comes from Glenn Guzzo's excellent book Strat-O-Matic Fanatics. Among other early stories, this book describes how young Hal Richman felt frustrated with Ethan Allen's game since there was no pitching system. And the lack of a pitching system in Ethan Allen's game was really a problem. Same thing is true of National Pastime, by the way. In fact, as silly as it might seem, one of the reasons why APA was so successful is because it offered some kind of pitching system, something that really no baseball game before it had ever done. Well, I'm pretty sure that Hal was also frustrated with the spinning mechanic, which often got stuck in between results. And so Hal Richman started to come up with his own game, one that used poker cards to initiate the action. And at some point in time, he decided to move over to dice. So what does this have to do with Ethan Allen's game? Well, if you've played it all with the Founders Edition, you've noticed that there's something odd about it. You'll notice that there's no fielding system, and that corresponds perfectly with Ethan Allen's game. In All-Star Baseball, a spin would give you a number, not a result. You'd have to look that number up on this chart, but notice something, there's no differentiation between fielders. That's right, a ground out is simply a ground out, a fly out is a fly out. All-Star Baseball had 3 kinds of ground outs and 3 kinds of fly outs, all of which would do something different to the runners on base. And Strat-O-Matic had the exact same fielding mechanic. A ground ball C would always result in the runners advancing. Ground ball A, meanwhile, was always bad for the offense, and ground ball B was always some kind of fielder's choice. There were also 3 different options for fly balls, and errors never specified the player making the error. There was no X chart or anything fancy like that. Now, of course, I don't know for an absolute fact that Hal Richman simply copied the fielding system from All-Star Baseball. All I know is that they're basically the same concept that's presented a little bit differently. But we should focus on what Richman did that was different. The player interaction in Strat-O-Matic is simply fantastic. Well, think back to APA for a minute. In APA, all pitchers can do is prevent singles from being hit. There's sort of an interaction, but only in very specific situations. Most of the time you're just rolling the dice and looking at a hitter's card. In Strat-O-Matic, however, half the results are on the hitter's card and half are on the pitcher's card. So if your white die is a 1, 2, or a 3, you read it from the hitter's card. A 4, 5, or 6 goes to the pitcher's card. And as you can see, that white die doesn't necessarily mean something good will happen for that player. Hitters can strike out when they win the battle, and pitchers will give up home runs when they win the battle. This is that infamous 50-50 system. This is a system that remains controversial to this day. And the funny thing is that I saw some problems with the system as I played through my games. I've seen a couple of pitchers hit home runs because they happened to get the roll on the pitcher's card. Sure, things are set up today to prevent that from happening, but not back in 1961. The other magic of Strat-O-Matic comes from the way the results are differentiated. You add 2 dice together instead of combining them. For example, I rolled column 3 here, that's the white die, with a red 4 and a red 5. You add 4 and 5 together to get a 9. So if Harmon Killebrew were up to bat, he would strike out. But if it were Mickey Mantle instead, he would walk. Now, if you map out all the dice roll probabilities, you get something like this. As you can tell, some rolls are much more common than others. And if you want something more precise, well, here you go. You get a 7 about 17% of the time, while a 2 or a 12 won't even show up 3% of the time. Honestly though, when you play this game, you don't really think much about those kind of charts or probabilities. The nicest thing about Strat-O-Matic is that every roll of the dice is different. It feels like an adventure. You don't have roll 66 like in National Pastime or APA where you know that it's good no matter what. With Strat, you always have to check. And with Strat, you don't need those big boards. Now, there was a strategy card, of course, to take care of some of the basic tasks. The sacrifice and squeeze play systems were the same for all players. The same was true of the hit and run system, and there was a house rule prohibiting pitchers from even trying that play. And even here, Richman took inspiration from Ethan Allen, who had separate spinners for those special plays. But stolen bases were a different story. Well, in the original Strat-O-Matic baseball, every player had his own stealing rating, and all steals were called by the manager. Maury Wills, for example, was an awesome base stealer. Harmon Killebrew, in contrast, would likely get caught if you sent him. This was an obviously more complex and robust system than the old National Pastime system of having certain dice rolls, 10 and 11, dictate stealing. Plus, in Strat, you could get thrown out. And I shouldn't forget about the pitcher's hitting card. Now in APA, somebody like Allie Reynolds in 1950 would receive a card that shows his hitting ability and not his pitching ability. But in Strat-O-Matic, Whitey Ford's card was a pitching-only card, and so Richman created a separate card just for pitchers to bat. Well, I guess this is controversial, though the truth is that just about every game has followed Hal Richman's footsteps. Strat did eventually create more pitchers hitting cards than just one, but it still, to this day, does not offer individual cards for pitchers when they go up to bat. Now, there is one other development that Richman made, one that was quite revolutionary. Well, that would be this, the split result. If you roll a white 5 and then a 4, you wind up with this split result. All split results are out of 20 chances. In the old days, you had a deck of 20 cards, each with a number on it that you were supposed to shuffle, and then you would draw the split card. These days, of course, all of us roll a 20-sided die instead. I'm pretty sure that this evolved from Richman's use of poker cards for randomization in his actual beta versions of this game, but the cool thing is that this offered him a degree of precision that no other baseball game had. It also meant that you could wind up with some really dramatic and meaningful, intense 20-sided dice rolls. But, of course, not everything about Strat-O-Matic was great, and let's get into some of the problems with the original edition. This part is actually pretty easy. The Founders Edition didn't include any complete teams. Instead, there were 5 players per team for some sort of strange all-star team. But the problem is that the player selections had nothing to do with the actual 1960 all-star teams. He just chose 5 players per team, that was it. There were actually 2 All-Star games in 1960, one in Kansas City and one in New York City. It doesn't make sense to me since both of the rosters were exactly the same, but whatever. Richman's problem is that he missed a ton of All-Stars. 10 American League All-Stars were not carded by Strat-O-Matic, as well as 11 National League All-Stars. In fact, of the 80 players who received cards, 40 of them were not All-Stars. That's 50%. Well, this created a problem since the original Strat-O-Matic advertisement clearly stated that the players were all-stars. But the biggest problem is that fans could not conduct an actual replay, which they could with other games. They couldn't even get close to a replay. All you could do is draft the players and play a couple games featuring teams that don't really exist and that you don't care about. And even a full replay is out of the question. Now, if you look closely, you'll notice that there were only 6 catcher cards, and one of them was Yogi Berra, who was arguably an outfielder by that time. Guys like, say, Sherm Lawler weren't carded, and that meant that if you had 4 teams of 20 guys each, 2 of the teams would only have 1 catcher. And the other problem was that Richman made way too many pitcher cards, 32 in all out of 80 players. And all of those pitchers were starting pitchers. In fact, it seems to me that Hal Richman went out of his way to avoid creating relief pitchers. I don't understand why, but I do know that it makes the game kind of awkward to play. Of course, if you know about Ethan Allen's game, you know that it also only featured all-star players and no actual complete teams. And I don't think that that's a coincidence at all. Now, I know that Richman didn't have a lot of money at the start, but it's pretty clear that his biggest gaming influence was All-Star Baseball, not APA. Anyway, whatever the reason is, the Founders Edition simply feels awkward. It's almost like the game wasn't finished yet. Well, the lack of a fielding system just feels wrong. It's so boring when everything is a ground ball or a fly ball and nobody actually fields the ball. In that sense, you have to kind of think of the Founders Edition as a sort of beta version of Strat-O-Matic, and the truth is that the game at the time was really not that successful. In fact, most of the original 1961 games that were sold were returned to the company. Fans were upset that they couldn't play with full teams. Richman kept at it though and included a few full teams in 1961 along with more all-stars. But it wasn't until the 1962 season was released in 1963 that Richman created 20 full teams. And not surprisingly, that 1962 season was his biggest seller. That was his killer app. It was that game that really put Richman on the map and allowed him to make Strat-O-Matic his full-time job. And that just goes to show you how important market research really is. Honestly though, aside from the roster, I can't find anything else to complain about. Strat-O-Matic is simply a joy to play, even with the little problems. Alright, I know that I'm not really doing Strat-O-Matic justice with this video because we're only looking at the Founders Edition. I do have later versions of the game. I have a whole bunch of cards in the basement, and we're going to do a few follow-ups that look specifically at those versions. So if you're a Strat-O-Matic fan, stick around. We'll have a lot of great stuff for you.